Welcome to the Insight Myanmar podcast. Before we get into today's show, I wanted to let you know that we have a lot more written and video content on our website. If you haven't visited it yet, we invite you to take a look at insightmyanmar.org. In addition to complete information about all of our past podcasts, there's also a variety of blogs, books, and videos to check out, and you can also sign up for a regular newsletter. But for now, enjoy what follows, and remember, sharing is caring.
My name is Chris Milligan, and I worked for the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, USAID, for 31 years, actually. In that time, I had a focus on development, but I also gained significant humanitarian assistance experience. For example, I was in charge of the U.S. government's response to the Haiti earthquake in 2010. As you recall, that was a massive earthquake. One of my first assignments at USAID was running an airlift for just in Rwanda, just pre-genocide. Also did numerous other humanitarian assistance assignments. I've worked across the globe. I set up operations in Iraq at the beginning of the Second Gulf War. I've worked in Indonesia, Zimbabwe, Ecuador, Madagascar, Mozambique. But of course, I would consider the highlight of my career was reopening the USAID mission in Yangon in 2012. At that time, the military government had some reformers who were opening up to the West. The United States government had a policy called Action for Action. So if the military government took a reform, the US government would meet it with an action. The military government, for example, released Aung San Suu Kyi. We restored diplomatic relations. Aung San Suu Kyi ran for parliament. We restored our development program. So I arrived in country in 2012, and I immediately grasped the complexity of the political situation in the country, because within 72 hours, I was in Rakhine State, which was undergoing a humanitarian assistance crisis there. I stayed in Myanmar until 2016, following the 2015 elections and the installation of the Aung San Suu Kyi government. At which point, then I went to Mozambique. So that's my, I think, relevant background for this conversation.
I would say that's extremely relevant. And I think what really stands out is your experience heading USAID in Burma, not just heading it, but heading it at such a pivotal moment when it literally wasn't allowed in. Prior to that, you were really coming into new ground, as well as contrasting your involvement in the Haiti earthquake. I think that will also be relevant. So there's a lot there to go into, but I'd like to start with the Burma experience, because I think there's a couple layers to this. I mean, one is just the layer of heading a USAID mission in Burma, because what we're seeing with disaster relief now, I think that's going to be highly relevant. But the second is how unusual your experience was in that involvement, because as you've said, there was this this was predicated on an American policy where there were certain things expected or waiting to be seen from the military government at that time. And when those were fulfilled, USAID then chose to have a presence. And that must have been just a very unique and new experience to not just take over a mission, but to establish one where it wasn't allowed before.
Correct. Established one because we had no staff. I opened the door to our offices. It was an empty room. There were one or two people who had maintained a presence and who were very knowledgeable, but really it was not even close to a mission. And we were told to get things up and running and hire staff and get programs on the ground because President Obama was going to come. As you recall, he came for his historic first visit, and he would cut the ribbon to the USAID mission. So we were under a lot of pressure as well. We realized at that time that although we are a development agency, we were not doing development. We were still engaging with the military government, and we didn't want to have a development lens on what we did. What we were doing instead, and this is going to sound very nuanced, was using the tool of development to advance Burma's democratic and economic reforms. We didn't want to use development to justify the military government. We wanted to use the tool of development to continue those reforms. And so we did an enormous amount of work working on, with civil society, political party development, independent media. And we also, of course, dealt with the election commission. And that was controversial in itself because it was run by the military government. But there was a level of trust we had to build to make sure that the assistance we provided, again, would be used in an accountable way, and that we would go forward to have free and fair elections, which they had in 2015. So there was an arc there, getting to the country. There weren't really many programs being managed inside the country. Stand up new programs, leverage the ones that had been run from Thailand, bring them over, recruit new staff, build the office, and at the same time, make sure we didn't empower the military government, but rather push forward on economic and political reforms.
So in that regard, would you say that the particular, because you've had such an extensive background in USAID, you have a lot to compare it to in other missions you went, would you say that your mission in establishing that office in Burma, that it was quite different or unique compared to some of the other missions around the world in which you served?
Absolutely. I have served in very complex areas. I established our mission in Iraq during the war. But the history of Burma is so unique and so complex that one of my frustrations were you'd have a lot of people coming in from the international community and they wanted to do good work, but they wouldn't understand the situation. So I would call Burma at the time, I said, it's a land of good intentions with unintended consequences.
Yeah.
People who arrived in the country and they thought, well, I did this in Rwanda and it worked there, therefore it'll work here. Not realizing who they were working with, whom they were empowering. And so there was at first deep suspicion from the civil society about these international donors, and rightly so, because they were, one, concerned that their own mission, civil society's own mission, would be corrupted by donor money. And secondly, there was a lot going on behind the bamboo curtain before it opened up to the West. And these civil society organizations were doing amazing work in promoting reforms, beginning from one sector, say health or another, and then promoting democratic reforms coming of it, promoting women's empowerment out of that. And they were genuine, legitimate civil society organizations that risk being led astray, if you will, by donor money. What I really mean by that is we always want to make sure that the organizations we work with don't lose accountability to their people. But sometimes when donors come in with a lot of resources, the accountability goes back up to the donor, and then it corrupts the relationship. We were very sensitive about that, and this was also something we wanted to make sure did not occur in Burma at the time. So, long answer to your question, but the operating environment in Burma was so unique. Burma's history is so unique that it isn't a one cookie cutter model approach to reform. You really had to understand the history of the country, the history of the different ethnic groups, where they were coming from, because if you didn't, you could not only would you do no harm, you could do harm. And I'll say this final thing before turning the mic back to you. development itself is not good or bad. It's how it's done. Just because you're doing something that you think is good doesn't mean it's good. If you don't understand where you're working and the relationships there and the power dynamics, then you could actually do harmful things. You could end up empowering the elites rather than the people. You could end up reversing the accountability systems. So you really have to understand the unique operating environment, not only nationally, but also within the regions and sub-regions of the country.
That's fascinating, and I want to get a bit more granular in the last thing that you said to get to have a better understanding of how that was playing out. So you're talking in generalities that that Burma's this land of good intentions with unintended consequences. That's a great line, and that you were in a vantage point of seeing people come in without an appreciation for that complexity, trying to implement their own programs or goals, and sometimes having very much the reverse effect and empowering absolutely the wrong people on the end that they were hoping for. I wonder if you can give an example, a concrete example of this happening, without naming names, of course, or revealing things that might be sensitive, but just an example that allows our listeners to grasp a little more on how these dynamics might take place of someone coming in really with an intention and a plan and it just going exactly the wrong way.
This is a very minor example, but it's a good example. It's a very concrete example, but a minor one. In many countries, you want to host a meeting and you want to bring civil society people together. And you don't want to insult them, so you want to do it in a nice hotel, treat them well. And so there was this one donor who tried to convene all the civil society organizations, these real grassroots organizations that have been working hard behind the bamboo curtain. And basically rented out a very expensive hotel room. It turned out to be owned by a crony.
Uh-huh.
No shock. But so the civil society said, well, wait a minute, you're inviting us to this hotel, which is run by the cronies, which are military cronies, by the way, cronies linked with the military. You're just by doing this, just by doing that, you're funding the military and their enterprises, and then you expect us to come. And so right there, the trust between civil society and the international community took a step back. And this is the minor example. But if you don't know, if you don't know the history of the country, then you really could end up in creating a more negative atmosphere. The operating environment in Burma was the most complex I'd ever experienced in my 30 years of working in development. How many ethnic groups exist in Burma? I mean, I know there's the official number of 135, which goes all the way back to colonial days. It's probably far greater than that. How many armed ethnic groups are there in Burma? And knowing the history of the Karen people and their struggle and the longest running civil wars in our lifetime, if you don't understand the history and the context and the complexity, then you're not going to be helpful to the country. So other countries I've been in don't begin with that level of complexity.
Right. So that was in your mind really the defining feature that made it that challenging to be able to operate.
Right. I mean the correct the fact of the other countries have certainly many ethnic groups and different languages, but the enormity of it in Burma, and of course the history of the Burmese Empire, and how they incorporated the ethnic states, just the history of the Rakhine State and the independent Rakhine State, and the tension between the Rakhine and the Burmese, and and going back to the last war between them and all. I mean, if you don't understand that, then you really don't understand the context today of things.
So you were there 4 years, and those were 4 very impactful years of 2012 to 2016. A lot of things happened in that time, and you had quite a tall order ahead of you in what you were trying to accomplish. How did you feel at the end of that mission? How satisfied do you feel in terms of what you accomplished, and maybe if there are some things you feel you left on the table?
I was very satisfied, but not personally satisfied. I was actually very proud of what we together, USAID and the Burmese people together that we all accomplished. Because in many countries I've been to, there's been a long development presence, maybe decades, and the development grants seem to be like an expectation, a given, and you don't really see much progress. The progress I saw in Burma was extraordinary. I saw people who had been held back, who knew that they were a great country, and they wanted to reclaim that, and that any assistance you provided, they gave dividends to. I was just amazed. I mean, because when I got to Yangon, there were no cars really, and people said there were more cell phones in North Korea than there were in Burma at the time, and there certainly weren't a lot of cell phones. I left in 2016, and then people tell me after that they had Uber. Traffic jams, had Uber.
Yeah.
I've been in countries that'll never get to the Uber level, right? We brought in coffee growers. We went up to Rakhine State. And these coffee growers sat down and they were talking to the local farmers about what the requirements are to export coffee. And the farmers were like taking notes. And the international buyers were a bit skeptic because they said it's really hard to hit these standards. Here's the standards of quality. You have to be able to guarantee a certain supply. There should be like a narrative around it about, empowering women or something like that because that we can sell it better, blah, blah, blah. And they were skeptical that these local farmers would be able to export coffee, but they did in record time. So I had felt that the assistance we gave was appreciated, and that it was well used, and that culminated with the democratic election. It was inspiring to all of us. It was completely free, completely fair. There was no violence. It was a celebration, if you will. Those were all the positive things. My biggest regret is that I wasn't able to make an impact on the situation in Rakhine State. Mm-hmm. That it became intractable, that there's continued human suffering there, and that it tears the country apart, and it in fact it impacts lives. And so my first trip in country within 72 hours was to go to Rakhine State because there had been an uptick in violence. And then I would go repeatedly over 4 years. I don't know how many times I went. We gave humanitarian assistance. We tried getting communities to work together, but we didn't make any progress. And I continued to see the suffering all across Rakhine State that this violence was causing. And that's my big regret, that I wasn't able to, nor has anybody else really been able to make much progress there.
I think the other side of this question that has to be asked, especially in light of the way that this current U.S. administration has characterized USAID, is I'm very curious your take on the flip side of that question, which is how did those 4 years of your mission and the USAID's mission in Burma benefit America during that time?
Right. USAID is considered a national security agency. We sit on the National Security Council. We help inform foreign policy. We give humanitarian assistance because we're a generous country, and humanitarian assistance is given on a needs basis. The development assistance we give is actually in our national interest because it prevents the spread of pandemics from coming to America. It creates stable democracies overseas that have growing economies that can be trading partners. It creates investment opportunities for U.S. businesses. It also mitigates conflict and prevents U.S. soldiers from having to be involved and risking their lives. Closer to home, it creates stable countries so we don't have waves of migrants coming into the United States looking for jobs because they have jobs and stability back home. So development is in our national interest. It benefits us back home. And what I saw with USAID was this deepening connection between the United States and the people of Myanmar, Burma. We, for example, twin U.S. universities with their counterparts in the country. We twin private sector entities with also universities to help fund biology laboratories and research. So USAID was a catalyst that could strengthen the ties between the people of the United States and the people of Burma. And it was very robust at the time, and so I definitely think that the assistance we provided absolutely benefited the people of Burma, but it also paid dividends and benefited the people of the United States.
Looking at Burma's geopolitical position and the wider region of where it's located, and looking at American interests in that region, what role was USAID playing in serving American interests as the mission was reestablished there, and really aligning with American interests, keeping the focus on U.S. policy and the benefits of the American people?
I think in the sense that it was welcoming Burma into the community of democracies, the community of private sector markets, the community of progress. There are competing models out there, and Burma knows because it's among many of them, right? And so I think having USAID there, having other Western development agencies, not only was enormously helpful for developing the economy and also the open society of the country, but it also was good in sort of like increasing the bonds between Burma and, if you will, the global community of democracies.
That's an interesting line you have, that there are competing philosophies out there, competing foreign missions. And I think this is a good time to go into what those competing foreign missions are. What are different models of first of all, how would you define the US model? You've already broken it down a little bit, but how would you define what that is, and then contrast it to what those other competing models would be?
Right. I think the US model was formed at the end of World War II. And, with the standing up of these so-called liberal Western institutions. I mean, it's based on private sector, rights of individuals, freedom of the press, rule of law, participatory government, and and I said, like an empowered private sector. The other competing model now in the world, of course, is the model that China presents. China needs a world that looks like China, and it's investing in that. It's investing it through the Belt and Road Initiative. It's the largest creditor in the world. China is also the major trading partner for 120 countries around the world. And so it's only natural that countries act in their own self-interest. So to further China's own self-interest, it is creating a world that looks like China. Adopts the Chinese model, which is not the Western model, if you will. It's not just owned by not just promoted by the United States, but also the West. And again, this is not a criticism of anybody. This is what countries do in their own self-interest.
Yeah.
And what we had seen was happening in Burma over the decades was that really Burma was becoming more dependent upon China, almost like not a colonial state, but you could see the raw resources were leaving Burma. Obviously the gems and the rubies, the jade, the pipelines, things like that, and was becoming economically subservient to China, which we don't think would benefit the growth of Burma. We believe that a more free market where individuals can make their own judgments on what's in their own self-interest and how to invest, it would be the better way.
Now, you served in USAID, as you said, for several decades. So you served under several very different administrations from two different political parties and different foreign policies. As you would see different presidents and different parties take office, what effect did that have on your mission and the work that you were carrying out?
Honestly, up until the current administration, very little. I served across 6 different presidential administrations. But because development is in a national interest, and because it's really about national security, the vast majority of what USAID does between different political administrations doesn't really change. Now, what changes is sometimes the priorities. Under a Democratic, you may have certain priorities where you invest more in healthcare, more in climate change, right? And under the Republicans, more in the private sector, perhaps. But those really aren't major changes. This is tweaking allotments of resources. The other thing to note is that USAID's funding comes from Congress. And Congress generally provides earmarks and directives on what USAID should do. Provides about 90 to 98% of USAID's budget is directed by Congress. So, for example, even under the first Trump administration, we saw our funding for climate change increase, even though it wasn't a presidential priority at that time. Ironically, under the first Trump administration, USAID thrived. The political leadership team came in and they said, what do we need to do to help you do your job better? What are the reforms that have to happen? How do we strengthen the workforce? And so there was an enormous reform effort that was called transformation. It was the largest reorganization, certainly in my time at USAID. And as a result, USAID was more fit for purpose. We were more adapted to meeting the global challenges. What do I mean by that? For example, we stood up a new bureau called the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, whereas before humanitarian assistance was buried under a larger global bureau with democracy and conflict, it was a standalone because the understanding is that today's world is quite complex. There's more conflict than ever before. The conflict is protracted, is difficult, and there's been a huge spike in the need for humanitarian assistance. So we stood up a whole new bureau. We stood up a bureau on conflict prevention and mitigation, if you will, conflict prevention and stabilization, because of the increase in conflict in the world. So under the first Trump administration, we did these incredible reforms that strengthened USAID. The advisor to the president, Ivanka Trump, launched a women's entrepreneurship initiative at USAID. First Lady Melania visited programs in Africa. She praised them. She praised the education efforts. So it was a very positive experience, which contrasts completely with what's going on now.
Right. So what you're describing is not just a schizophrenic response to really what we've seen under all administrations previous to this one, but even schizophrenic to the first Trump administration. Was there anything that was warning you to how extreme of a shift this would be?
I don't think any of us ever anticipated this. When I talked to former officials in the first Trump administration, well-established Republicans, well-connected Republicans, they said we didn't see this coming, and no one would really believe that anyone would disassemble the world's largest development and humanitarian assistance agency, because everyone understood how important that was to the United States, let alone to other communities around the world. So it was, I think, completely unexpected.
Right. I want to shift focus for just a moment, and then come back to this to bring these threads together, because I want to go now to USAID response to disasters, because of course everything we're talking about is leading to the disaster of this earthquake and the response to it. And I think a helpful contrast is that you were in Haiti when a massive earthquake struck then, and so you were you witnessed and were a part of the USAID response at that time. Can you share what happened then?
Right, and I could definitely share what happened then. And again, Haiti was so unique, given the proximity of the United States and the military assets we already had in the country. But let me take a step back and say just generally what happens when there is a disaster. Because USAID is the lead for international disaster assistance for the whole federal government. And we can even tap into other federal government resources that we need. If we need military lift, we have relationships with the military to move things around, for example. So generally what happens if there is a large internet disaster that clearly is going to overwhelm the capacity of the country to respond, our people in the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance would already be working on it. They would be contacting people, finding out who's available, who could go, what would be needed. What would be required is for that country itself to request international assistance. And they do that, but they channel that request through the United Nations. At that point, the U.S. ambassador in any country then sends a cable to Washington saying, I certify that the country does not have the capacity to respond to this disaster by itself, that it will allow the assistance to come in and that it would be useful and it's in our interests. And the USAID would send a disaster assistance response team. We call them DARTs because they're fast and nimble. Disaster Assistance Response Team, DART. Each member of that team has a very sophisticated technical specialty. There's one person, for example, who would know a lot about shelter, another about hygiene, clean water access, emergency food relief, and then in the case of an earthquake, there would be search and rescue capabilities. USAID keeps connections and actually contracts with two major urban search and rescue groups in America. One's on the West Coast in Los Angeles, and the other's on the East Coast in Fairfax County. They're on these two coasts so we can deploy them as quickly as possible to sites. So, for example, when there was the major earthquake in Turkey in 2003, we deployed a DART. The DART hit the ground within hours, and it eventually grew to be about 200 people, of which 160 were urban search and rescue. And they bring in sniffer dogs and they bring in all their own equipment because they can't live on the local economy because it's in shambles. So they're self-sufficient, right? That's sort of what we do. And the Turkey earthquake or the Nepal earthquake is sort of a better example than the Haiti one, given the close Haiti was. But so then the urban search and rescue, they've got really 72 hours or up to 4 or 5 days to find people alive and pull them out of buildings. After that, the possibility of finding someone alive decreases significantly. And that's why we deploy these people as quickly as possible, to get them on the ground with their dogs and save lives. Then what we also do is we have pre-positioned around the world emergency relief supplies in warehouses. And they're placed around the world so they can be moved immediately to the areas where necessary. For example, I believe somewhere in Malaysia and Dubai and other places, they include plastic sheeting that can be used into shelter, jerry jugs for carrying water, cooking supplies, pots and pans, things that people need to survive. So we would start deploying those. We would also take funding and we would provide it to those entities that we know are on the ground and can work quickly. We know that when it comes to food distribution, the World Food Program is excellent, and they have deep connections and relationships in many countries around the world. So we would probably provide them with funding. They would inevitably have launched an appeal, and we would give them a same amount of money to provide emergency food. We would also look at the local NGOs, like for example, in Burma, Save the Children has grassroots connections. And when we worked during her cyclone in August, we worked a lot with Save the Children and others to get funding quickly to them because they actually had relationships with the local communities. So once the initial period is called relief. That's when you try to find people, you try to prevent a second wave of death from diseases and lack of health care. So you set up clean water systems and shelter and other things to avoid that second wave of death. And then you start focusing on recovery. What's necessary to reopen the businesses, to clear the rubble, what needs to be repaired, how to get things patched up so services can begin being established and run again. And then finally, you look at reconstruction, which is a much longer window. A reconstruction are there key ministry buildings that have to be built, or houses or bridges and things like that? What's required that? And all of this is done by experts who have such technical and career years and decades of expertise in this subject matter. And the final thing you do is you always want to look at the humanitarian to development nexus, because generally what can happen, what we've learned, is there's this enormous rush of resources that come quickly with humanitarian assistance, and takes a longer time to get the development assistance going back again. And there can be a gap, and progress can drop off, and there can be backsliding, if you will. So you want to make sure that the handoff between humanitarian assistance and development is smooth, and there isn't that gap, so that progress can be continued to be made.
That's an excellent description and overview. And I think as I hear this, I think what becomes so evident is how much work must have gone into building these extremely complex systems, pulling on such different individuals to react and respond in the way they do at different times from different places with different skills, and how the dismantling of that, how we always hear that some of the things that are being dismantled, they can't just go right back up. And I think this explanation really reveals, the complexity of all of these layers that must have taken a long time to, by trial and error, to figure out how to build the right way and fit together the right way, and how the sudden and immediate dismantling of them leaves a gap that can't just be reinstated, and that has this enormous vacuum in this place.
Right. And let me give you a little factoid, if you will, that kind of expresses exactly what you're saying. USAID, there are many different federal departments and agencies of the United States, and some are quite sophisticated. You know, NASA, scientists, the U.S. Academy of Sciences. USAID has the highest educational level of any federal agency, more than NASA, and that's because development is a discipline. And there's so many different sectors in it that you really require that level of expertise. The other thing that helps enormously when you have a disaster in a country is the ability to pivot your existing development programs on that need. So in the hours following a disaster, before the stuff can come from warehouses, you can talk to the people who are running your existing programs and say, okay, look, we know you have this and that. Please focus now on, for example, Mandalay, right? The community work you're doing in Yangon, look, get it up to Mandalay. Who do you know there? What do you have? What do you have in your warehouses? How can you move that up, right? So having a development program with relationships in country gives you the ability to respond more quickly. And then also use those programs as sort of pipelines that you can put your resources through to get to the communities and assure accountability the whole time.
So that's another massive loss, not just the loss of the enormous expertise and layers of working together, but also the incalculable loss of what it takes to establish local networks. And then again, we're talking about Myanmar, the complexity that you described at the beginning now in all of your 30 years, that Myanmar, the level of complexity and discord, we could even say there, that you experienced, the ability to be able to establish those networks, that's no small thing. And so, that's just, it just sounds like loss on top of loss.
It is. The current administration canceled nearly 5,400 contracts and grants. They would take years and years and years to do over. It takes a long time to first design a program thoughtfully with input from the local communities.
Yeah.
Then you have to put out to tender, a competitive process. It would take years and years. So USAID has lost the most technically competent people in the U.S. government. They've all been fired. They've been given orders that they will be let go. Either their end date is July or September, depending which letter they got. And all the programs, 84% of programs were terminated. Some of those programs were critical humanitarian assistance programs. 4 humanitarian assistance programs that were providing support prior to the earthquake to inside Myanmar, Burma, were terminated. Again, so those relationships are gone. The ability to ramp up those programs, to provide humanitarian is gone. And when we look at the 5,400 programs that were canceled, some of them were the ones providing logistical support to move relief items from warehouses to areas where they're crisis, or to transport the humans and dogs and equipment required for the urban search and rescue. So today, we have urban search and rescue teams sitting in Virginia and California, and they should be in Mandalay. They should be in Navy. They should be in the areas. They should be pulling people out of buildings. And that window is almost closed to save lives, because I told you after 5 days, you're really not going to find anybody.
That's so hard to hear. And it's and just shifting the focus a bit on Myanmar itself, I'm reminded by a couple of days ago, we spoke to Theory, and she described the dark humor that the Burmese community is living with now. And she spoke on the podcast about how Burmese Buddhists believe in 8 different hell realms that one passes through, and that the Burmese are now joking in a dark way that they've entered the ninth floor of hell that no one knew existed until modern day Myanmar. She talked about, during COVID, Burmese died. During the coup, more died. During the long resistance period, the collapsed economy, more died still. And then the earthquake, more deaths. And that and before the earthquake, USAID, obviously the USAID cuts, and even just looking before the earthquake, just for a moment, the cuts that happened to independent media, that were operating under extreme circumstances of trying to get the truth out about the conflict and the brutality of the military, the support for the democratic movement and the various ways that took, as well as the health, that we've talked about, health and humanitarian. That was, even in the last few weeks, that's been reported as the devastation that, in looking at the USAID cuts, Burma has been a focus of international media as being especially and cruelly targeted, just literally hours after the dismantling of USAID, that, as you're describing in all of this detail, had the infrastructure, the setup, the logistics to be able to respond, and everything was just pulled out when the worst, most unimaginable natural disaster would occur. So it's really, just looking at it from that Myanmar perspective, the bad luck on top of bad luck, it's hard to put words to.
And I would add one more layer to what you've said, and this is what I find difficult to really accept. The American people have stood with the people of Burma for decades.
Yeah,
we've been there during the darkest time. We were there helping with their struggle. We were giving voice to their need. We were always there and working in partnership at those most difficult times, trying to support those in Burma who were pushing for Burma. So, given this long history of support, of trust, how could this happen now? I mean, did we part of the problem, allowing Burma to slip to that ninth layer of hell, because we're not there now? We have the assets, we have the capability, but because we have dismantled a humanitarian development agency, we are not able to provide the support we should to our good friends.
And let us not forget, too, that Burma was one of the rare, very rare bipartisan issues that was occurring in American politics for decades, even as things became much more divisive leading up to where we are now. Let us not forget the very good friends of Burmese democracy, of, ranging from George W. Bush, Laura Bush, of course, Mitch McConnell. There are others that we could put there that was really not a controversial issue from any side of how important it was for American policy to be on the right side of history here.
It's correct. It's correct.
Going back into your history of the way that the United States and USAID would respond to these disasters taking place, you reference any number of them. Turkey and Haiti, and even Cyclone Nargis. Some other ones I think that you threw in there. If we can get a sense of numbers, and I don't know how much you can just pull these numbers off the top of your head or estimates, both numbers in terms of the dollars of aid that was put towards those disasters, as well as the numbers of people that were involved, because this will then give us a contrast of what's going on today.
So with respect to the current situation in Burma, I understand that we are sending a 3-person team, not a DART, not a disaster assistance response team, 3-person team, and that we've committed $2 million. Now, generally, we do a small commitment until the team gets on the ground and says they need more, until hopefully we'll provide more funding. Well, we could compare that to, say, Nepal. The Nepal earthquake in 2015, and some people tell me was significant, but the current situation in Burma really is much graver, and it's a larger disaster. Within the first 5 days, the U.S. government had committed $12.5 million. And within 2 weeks, it had committed $28 million. When we look at Cyclone Nargis, you can go to the Wikipedia page. I did, because they've taken down the USAID website, so I can't look into USAID files to say what we did, but Wikipedia has that. We flew in, it was dramatic. The U.S. Air Force flew in planes with relief commodities. And when I mentioned there's that continuum of relief, recovery, reconstruction, well, according to Wikipedia, it was well over $100 million. Wikipedia says 196, I think. I don't think all of those were related to Nargis, but certainly well more than $100 million, right? The Haiti earthquake, again, was special. $1 billion in humanitarian assistance, $1 billion in recovery. We had 20,000 troops to restore law and order. We had, and I mean, the mind-boggling scale of people on the ground. The Turkey earthquake, we had a disaster assistance response team of 200 people, 160 of which were urban search and rescue, pulling people out of buildings and determining whether structures were safe to go back into. So that tells you kind of where we are on the scale of things. Now, with respect to the current situation in Mandalay, the Chinese are there with, I think, multiple. I mean, they were probably over 100 now, and they've announced more funding. And initially it was 14 million, and now they're more than that. Russia has flown in planes. India has 4 planes and 4 ships en route. Vietnam has 100 people on the ground. Now, I would say that the quality of assistance that the United States provides is a good bang for your buck, because we have incredible expertise on providing humanitarian assistance. But the fact that Vietnam can have 100 people on the ground helping, and in the search and rescue, and we're on the sidelines, that doesn't make sense to me.
And so just looking at what $2 million and 3 people gives you from the American side, what can that do at a time like this, given what we're seeing after the destruction across Myanmar?
Well, 3 people will not give you the capability to be operational in saving lives. It doesn't, for example, a search and rescue team with sniffer dogs and equipment, 160 people, you are now bringing people alive out of buildings. 3 people who are humanitarian assistance advisors can't do that. What they can do is talk to other people and say, what are the greatest needs? How can the U.S. help? And how can our $2 million be most effective? And what they'll probably find out, so when there is a disaster, the United Nations sets up a cluster system. A cluster is a sector, right? So it'll be the water cluster, the shelter cluster, and then everyone sort of meets, all the sector experts meet in that cluster and try to figure out what the needs are. So all the information then flows together. And so we could find out, okay, really where the biggest gap could be in emergency food. So give $2 million to the World Food Program. Hopefully what would happen is that these 3 people would say, look, we have $2 million, but there is a gap of $34 million in needs, and that's what's required. And then there's a gap for recovery, and that's what's required, et cetera, et cetera. So that would be great. Hopefully this $2 million is just seed money, I would hope, and that it would grow. Usually we see that much faster. I gave the example of Nepal, where, within 5 days, they're already at 12.5, and within 2 weeks, they're at 28 million. So.
Of course, the one big difference in Burma compared to all those other places is that this has been an active conflict zone for 4 years, and that this is a military regime that the estimates now are that they control 20 to 30% of the country. They're craving legitimacy. They've never been, to put it lightly, they've never been all that reliable in being able to, or willing to want to put aid into the right places and the right channels. That's not self-serving of them. And so there's this extraordinary added complexity of even outside of the strangeness that's going on in our country, in our administration, our current administration, that it's also a very unique operating environment in Burma, that even if things were set up as they were in previous times, this is still not a very easy climate to navigate.
That's correct. It's not. USAID has extraordinary experience in working in very difficult political situations. For example, we were providing an enormous amount of emergency assistance in Tigray during the war there. Certainly continuing to provide emergency assistance in Sudan, which has now been declared a genocide, right? Inside Syria. And remember, we also provided assistance in 2008 to Cyclone Nargis. The Civil War makes it quite difficult. And of course, it is a unique operating environment. And it's not, you can't have a national response. You don't have clear communication networks. You don't have transportation networks. It's difficult. But the USAID and the organizations we work with have the experience of working in very in conflict areas, delivering and very difficult political situations. And if it turns out that the assistance is being co-opted by the military government or by anybody, then normally we turn it off or find other ways to do with that. I mean, there was several years ago when it was found that the Ethiopian government was alleged to have co-opted the food that was being provided by the World Food Program with USAID funding. Assistance was turned off until the accountability measures could be taken. And so there are people with the expertise and know-how on how to do this. There are the organizations on the ground that have the direct links to these communities. I mentioned Save the Children is one. I know there's many others, and there's many local organizations, and Better Burma has a good network there, where the assistance can go directly to those in need, and doesn't have to go through the military, and won't get coopted by the military or even directed by the military.
So you're talking about more of those outside operators, informal networks, local networks outside the more formal structures that the international community is want to follow. And one can't help but also look at those that have engaged right away. I'm just recalling your comment earlier in the conversation about how it's natural of states to want to engage in ways that benefit them and ways that they want to see the world. And so we've seen Russia and China engage. In a previous podcast conversation we just had, it was referenced that that there's already indications that the Russian aid has come to military compounds and military areas, which is not surprising. Chinese aid, I'm not exactly sure what it's done, but there's been that recent report that they were shot at. The military shot at the Chinese Red Cross, and so what you already referenced the 100 Vietnamese that were there, and noting that, however great it may be, that there are numbers of some people coming, that the level of expertise and ability that you find among USAID and the Americans is really something that puts it at an elite level. But looking at these complexities of just the Civil War, the military channels, the actors that have engaged, the level of expertise that they have, is a complex situation. But with the Americans removed, just as of now, 3 people, $2 million, what comments or outlook would you have of those that are there?
So the world has, or significant parts of the world have mobilized and responded. And I think that although we don't provide humanitarian assistance for political ends, we provide it based on need, there is a bounce you get from that. I mean, if you had Americans with search and rescue teams with a logo from the American people and USAID and American colors on, holding people out of the rubble. I think that is a very strong image. And it solidifies, again, the relationship between our two countries. And a big contrast with the military as well. But that's not there. Instead, you see others like China, and I am grateful that China is there and grateful that they are pulling people out of the rubble. Because at times like this, it's not about politics. It's about saving lives. And the bottom line is, if you can flood the zone and put more resources in to get people out of the rubble, more people will live. And the fact that the U.S. is sitting on the sidelines means people are trapped in rubble, and they're going to die in a terrible way.
We've spoken to other people this week in analyzing how aid can come in, and not looking so much at American engagement here, but just the international community, and that when the aid is going through those military channels, not just is it not getting to those people in need, but those very resources that are meant for them are in some ways used against them. So in some ways, the delivery of aid could actually be worse for the people than no aid at all, when the military is weaponizing it and using it as a source of harm. And so we haven't yet seen exactly what the current American administration is going to do, if they're going to do nothing at all, or if we, I'm tentative to say this, but I think it's something we have to address. Do you see any possibility or outlook that intentionally or unintentionally, and again, the complexity of Burma we have to reference as well, that the current administration would respond to this crisis in a way that could be worse than simply doing nothing at all?
I'm optimistic that won't happen. We still have an embassy. We have individuals on the ground there. They might not be humanitarian assistance experts, but they can also ensure the accountability. They have relationships with communities. They have communication networks. We would only work with trusted partners who know how to work with communities without benefiting the military. And we have a long, long history of working in the country with trusted partners in a way that doesn't benefit the military. We've done that, quite frankly, for decades. Now we want to retain that expertise, and I know we're starting to lose it because we're letting people go, but we still have, I guess, that muscle memory. And then we would also work probably closely with the UN agencies, who would be able to actually monitor and make sure that the assistance is not co-opted or directed or used to reward or punish communities. But I think what you raise is a genuine concern. It's something that, as a humanitarian assistance agency, we take seriously, and we work closely on to make sure that doesn't happen. So I would assume that should we provide more funding, that it would be done hopefully in this conscientious manner.
Right. Now, so often in the case of Burma, other repeated conversations that we've had on this platform have been the tension and the contrast between the reality that exists in the complexity of Burma and the way that it fits, or in many cases doesn't fit, into international structures and systems and protocols, and kind of the endless discussions on why are these protocols so set in not serving the aims that they have and not getting outside of being able to respond to what's actually happening. And this fits into any number of conversations, from legitimacy to sovereignty to recognition to operations and everything else. But as we're talking about it specifically in terms of aid and military channels, this is now taking on a wider conversation than just the Americans, also looking at other international bodies and structures in the way that they're engaging in Burma. And that's that, again, this complexity that you have a military that cannot be trusted, that weaponizes and uses what's given mostly to harm. And then you have a lot of informal networks of first responders, of local groups, of civic society, to say nothing of all the ethnic organizations and all of their background and expertise in what they do. But these often fall outside of the standardization of how international systems like to operate. And so what comments would you have about how there could be a way to engage that would be thinking outside of the box to be able to give aid to those who need it most, when that might not be the normal protocols that one likes to follow?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, that's an excellent question, and there's not an easy answer, and we could spend a long time on it. But I would also add that the international community and the United States government has been providing humanitarian assistance to Myanmar for decades. If you just even look at the situation in Rakhine State, right, and how politically fraught that was, and then the competition between the two communities over assistance and things like that, and whether it would be diverted or not. So there's a long history of providing humanitarian assistance in the country context of Myanmar. And we know that's an evolving country context. It's pendulum has swung from a democracy to a military government, and you go back decades, it gets swung in many different directions, right? But there is already the fact that there's a long history of providing humanitarian assistance in this difficult context. Secondly, it's the connections to the local communities, and whether working through local organizations or working with international organizations that can take the external money and get it to the local organizations. That's been invaluable as well. I think the challenge is, and it goes back to something we said at the very beginning, the challenge is if you are a new entity, you're coming in. If you say also, one, I'm a new entity, I'm bringing my resources in, and I want to use it to benefit myself politically, and I'm not going to work through the established structures, and I'm going to give the money the way I feel like I'm going to give, and I want to cozy up with the government, then you start undermining, then you start having the problem you just pointed out yourself. But I think if you go through the existing structures and processes that have been set up for, quite frankly, decades, then that goes further to safeguarding the funds.
To close out this discussion, and I really thank you for your time. I know that you've fielded a lot of media requests lately, as there have been a lot of interest in this and your background. There's been this debate of this kind of fabricated debate, we can say, of how USAID is not just a benefit to those that are being helped, but to the benefit of those that are giving. In this sense, the American people, American security, health, policy, et cetera. And so looking at it again from that perspective, we've clearly been able to outline the ways in which the Burmese people have suffered from this pooling of USAID both before and after the crisis. But looking at this crisis specifically and the lack of U.S. engagement there, in what you were quoted in another interview you gave recently as saying that this does not make America greater. Right. With this lack of engagement with after the earthquake. So in what ways, looking at it from an American point of view, is this lack of engagement and help in Mandalay and Sagaing also coming, in the long term or more indirectly, perhaps harming America itself?
Right. So let me take that in two ways. First, about the lack of America stepping up now with the specific example of Burma. And then more about what does the world look like without USAID and how does that impact America? Certainly, the fact that the United States government is not a player, or even a minor player, but not the major player as it would have been, it means we are a weaker international partner, and that we're ceding global leadership to others, and to, in this case, to China. That we are creating a political vacuum as well as a humanitarian assistance vacuum that others will fill. when you think about, we've dismantled now the largest bilateral development and humanitarian assistance agency, right? What does that mean to Americans? Well, it means more pandemics back home. When I was in Madagascar, I saw how USAID was able to snuff out pneumonic plague. USAID plays critical roles in ensuring that Ebola in West Africa doesn't spread. So, I mean, if you think COVID was bad, wait till pneumonic plague or Ebola comes to the United States. And at the same time, we're working on battling tuberculosis around the world, particularly in Burma, and those programs are being canceled. And when we have drug-resistant tuberculosis come to the United States, how's that going to impact America? Economically, 11 of America's 15 largest trading partners, 11 were recipients of foreign assistance. USAID procures more than $2 billion in agricultural products, provides it in humanitarian assistance overseas, over $1 billion in pharmaceutical products. We create export markets for U.S. goods and services and by creating economic growth in other areas. And we protect American farmers. For example, we're able to prevent the spread of agricultural diseases from wiping out the wheat harvest here in America by making sure that rust, which attacks wheat, is controlled and gotten rid of overseas before it comes back to America. It's a world with more conflict. USAID works to mitigate conflict around the world, areas like Sahel. And when there's more conflict, the U.S. military steps in, greater cost, larger loss of life. It's a less free world as we withdraw support from human rights advocates for free press. We withdraw support for free and fair elections. We withdraw support that makes democracies thriving and functioning and strong. So it's not a world that is where America is going to benefit. And as I said before, China is the lead economic partner for 120 countries around the world. The United States, by dismantling USAID, is creating a political vacuum because USAID connected the American people to tens of thousands of communities overseas, all from communities to local governments to national governments. That's gone. There's a political vacuum. And so others will fill it, as they should, to protect their own national interests and to create a world that looks and benefits them.
Thank you. That's a somber thought to end on, and I thank you for sharing your depth of background, experience, knowledge. This has been so insightful. I think for myself and certainly for listeners that have followed. I'd like to, as we walk away from this conversation, we've spoken of your extensive career and knowledge of USAID and development and how it's operated. I'd like to just close on a personal note because personally, you lived 4 years in Burma. I'm sure that you developed many friends, relationships, interactions with the culture, with travels. And so I'd invite you to share any personal reflections or anecdotes or thoughts just on your connection to the people in the country.
I don't know where to begin. We have another hour. One of my favorite things to do was just biking throughout the country. I got to Burma in 2012, and first we weren't even allowed to really go out of Yangon without getting permission from the government. But over the months and the years, more and more of the country opened up beyond the normal tourist, areas of Bagan and Lele. I biked through Chin State. I biked through, I biked all over not over the country, it's a big country, through huge parts of the country, meeting with local communities, and I did it with my Burmese friends. We'd stop at tea shops. In the morning we'd have Nanjito and Mohinga. There's the sense of community, the generosity. I mean, Burma is known as being one of the most generous countries in the world, and you could see it. And then the festivals, right? The communities coming together, whether it's the Balloon Festival or the Light Festival. I mean, just such a unique country with its own traditions and foods and languages, with warm people who were curious about foreigners and wanted to invite you to their homes. It was a magical 4 years, and that's why it was also inspiring. It made you want to work harder to support their own dreams and ambitions, because they saw a brighter future for themselves, and you wanted to help them get there.
We've come to the conclusion of today's episode, and as the conversation you've just heard underscores, the humanitarian situation in Myanmar is dire and demands immediate attention. For millions of people, the struggle for survival is an everyday reality, and the need for urgent humanitarian aid cannot be overstated. Through this platform, we aim to raise awareness and keep the focus on these critical issues. But awareness must lead to action, and this is the point where you can come in to make a real difference. By supporting the nonprofit mission of Better Burma, you'll be contributing to our wider effort to bring hope and relief to those who need it most. Your donation can go towards providing much-needed support to vulnerable communities in Myanmar and along the border that continue to be impacted by the military coup. Visit betterburma.org/donation to join this effort.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranam